Do you have any idea how much the electricity and water bills are, Father? You leave the lights on all night." My father would grumble, his voice sharp with irritation. My mother would sigh dramatically, her eyes flashing. "Did you spill again, Father? I just cleaned that." This was how they treated my grandfather after barely a year, once the $600,000 he'd left them had been carefully spent down to the last dollar. They became perpetually irritable, suffocating our family home with palpable tension and unbearable pressure, turning him from a welcomed guest into nothing more than a burden. And here I am, Thomas Kiwa, 30 years old, still lingering in my parents' old house in Tucson, Arizona, the very place I was born and raised. This is the cold, hard price I'm paying for a bold decision I impulsively made at 30. I used to be a senior software engineer in Phoenix, Arizona, a place many call the mini Silicon Valley that's rapidly booming. My salary, roughly $160,000 a year, was more than enough to build a comfortable, self-absorbed life within my own little bubble. But then, I just walked away from it all. It was a choice that now, as my eyes stare blankly at the cracked ceiling of this room, I can't quite define: brave or utterly foolish. I threw everything behind me to chase a startup dream. Since childhood, I'd been strangely drawn to the tactile sensation of clay, a quiet fascination that always lingered in the back of my mind, even though I'd had little formal exposure to it. I wanted to open a handcrafted pottery workshop where I naively envisioned my creations would perfectly blend contemporary flair with a fresh new spirit, overturning outdated values. Yet right now, that dream is nothing more than dried, lifeless lumps of clay abandoned in a dusty corner of a defunct studio, and a small looming bank loan ready to come due. Tucson, honestly, wasn't where I ever wanted to return. This city, with its saguaro cacti stretching skyward like silent ancient sentinels, quietly witnessing every change, isn't a place that nurtures grand ambitions. It's where I grew up, where I used to ride my rickety bike quietly under the blazing desert sun, where my parents, Martin Kiwa and Dolores Kiwa, built their lives. But coming back now, I feel like nothing but a pathetic failure. A 30-year-old man still clinging to his parents' coattails just for a place to sleep. Every time I step into the living room, I hear my father's heavy sigh, as if my very presence is an unspoken, unbearable burden. My father, Martin Kiwa, is the epitome of a patriarch, in the truest sense of the word. He's the eldest in our ancient Pueblo family lineage, always priding himself on shouldering responsibility, though sometimes I secretly think he simply enjoys the feeling of absolute control over everyone. He works as an HR manager for a small local business, nothing too flashy, but enough to keep our family firmly in the middle class. My dad's always fixated on money, on how to make more, on how to save face in front of relatives and friends. Money is the only thing that earns people's respect, Thomas. He'd grind out, his eyes sharp, as if trying to etch those words deep into my brain. I never once agreed with him. Perhaps that's why we've clashed so constantly since I was a kid right up until now. I'm 30, and he still looks at me like I'm a complete failure. My mother, Dolores, is a different kind of extreme. She's the type of person who can make you burst out laughing within seconds of meeting her, but then you quickly realize her smile often comes with an underlying agenda. She's graceful, sharp-witted, and has a knack for flattery when it suits her. She always knows how to appease Dad, soothing his fiery tempers, but I know she has her own careful calculations. "Life's a game, Thomas," she told me when I was just a little kid, "and you've got to know how to play to win." I'm genuinely not sure what game she's playing, but I've always felt she keeps a certain distance from me, as if I'm just a piece in her grand scheme, never truly the center of it. And then there's my grandfather, Benito Kewa, 83 years old. In the deepest corners of my mind, he's just a familiar name and a few fragmented memories. I remember meeting him only 3 times in my life when I was a tiny tot. My recollections of him are vague, like a faded old photograph. He was and is a master Pueblo potter, one of the last of his kind. Perhaps there's some unseen thread connecting us, because it was something that drove me to love shaping clay and choose it for my own venture. He lived a simple life in a respectable house in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My connection with my grandfather was largely severed because my parents had left our ancestral lands to pursue opportunities elsewhere, prioritizing financial stability and a modern American life. They wanted a different life, one unburdened by red dirt roads and the earthy breath of the clay my grandfather cherished. My aunt and uncle, Victor Kewa and Marisol Kewa, also drifted apart, each settling in their own distant corners, leaving my grandfather to live alone in his house for many years. After my grandmother passed away, I grew up in a modern environment with little exposure to our indigenous culture and traditions. My own pottery style reflected that. It embraced a contemporary aesthetic with sleek lines and industrial colors, a complete contrast to his traditional methods, something I never thought I needed to learn. Perhaps that's the best explanation for why I never regularly reached out to him to learn the very craft I chose to pursue. Everything changed one fateful morning when my phone rang. It wasn't my mom or dad, but an unfamiliar number. "Excuse me, is this Tomas Kewa? I'm your grandfather Benito Kewa's neighbor. He's fallen gravely ill and needs urgent care." The voice on the other end was filled with genuine concern. My entire family immediately had to converge on my grandfather's house in Santa Fe. When we arrived, the atmosphere in my grandfather's home was heavy, not with true worry, but with a palpable calculation in everyone's eyes. Grandfather Benito, frail as he was, still held a remarkable dignity. He looked at each of us, then his voice, though hoarse, rang clear. "I am old now, and I need one of my children to care for me until my last breath. This house, valued at over $600,000, is my only publicly known asset, and it will belong to whoever cares for me until I die." A flash of naked greed immediately ignited in my parents' and my aunt and uncle's eyes, like vultures sensing carrion. The room abruptly exploded into chaotic arguments. "I'll take care of you, Father. My house is spacious, comfortable. I'll give you the most attentive care." My father, Martin Kewa, as the eldest, immediately spoke up, desperately trying to project responsibility. My mother, Dolores Kewa, chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet. "Oh, Father, we've always loved you. You can rest assured with us. We won't let you want for anything." But Uncle Victor Kewa and Aunt Marisol Kewa weren't about to give up. "What are you talking about, Martin? You're too busy with work. How can you care for Father better than I can? I have far more free time." Uncle Victor slammed his hand on the table. Aunt Marisol added with a sarcastic edge, "Yes, and I'm close to the best medical facilities. Father's health is paramount, isn't it? I'll ensure he gets the best services." The open battle for guardianship raged on. Filled with hollow promises and fierce competition, each one desperate to prove themselves the most filial to claim the house. Money, just as my father always said, was the only thing these people truly cared about, and I watched the raw, ugly truth of their greed unfold before me, a truly disgusting spectacle. The argument escalated to a fever pitch, and Grandfather Benito, with weary yet resolute eyes, finally spoke up. "Enough," he commanded, his voice hoarse but strong enough to silence everyone. "I will stay with Martin and Dolores as they are the eldest. I expect you to honor your promise." That decision made my parents practically jump with joy, as if they had just won the lottery, despite the thinly veiled frustration of Uncle Victor and Aunt Marisol. Soon after, Grandfather Benito sold the house in Santa Fe to a booming tourist real estate project. He moved in with my family in Tucson. And of course, the proceeds from the house sale were directly transferred to my father's bank account, like an advance payment for the remaining days of his life. I was still living with my parents at the time, unmarried, and I felt a profound sense of unease settling over the house, a premonition of the turmoil that was surely to come. Looking back, I now wonder if Grandfather, in his quiet wisdom, was testing their true intentions, or perhaps simply offering them an opportunity they would inevitably squander. When Grandfather Benito first arrived, my parents had transformed our Tucson house into nothing less than a grand stage for filial piety. They took care of him with exaggerated attentiveness, threw a lavish birthday party complete with all his favorite traditional Pueblo dishes, invited close friends, and constantly uttered words of love and respect. "Welcome home, Father. Rest assured, you'll be taken care of best here," my mother said with a radiant smile, but I sensed something hollow beneath that perfect facade, a calculation hidden deep within her flawless act. I, still grappling with my own failures and living under their roof, witnessed it all with a faint, flickering hope that perhaps my family could change, that kinship would indeed triumph over greed. I genuinely believed it might be the start of a true reconciliation. However, after barely a year, once the $600,000 Grandfather Benito left had been almost entirely depleted by my parents' lavish expenses and personal projects, ranging from home renovations to extravagant trips to Hawaii, their attitude abruptly flipped 180 degrees like a layer of peeling paint revealing the dull, cracked wall beneath. The sweet words curdled into bitter complaints. My father began grumbling about the cost of caring for the elderly, his voice growing sharper. "Do you have any idea how much the electricity and water bills are, Father? You leave the lights on all night." My mother would sigh dramatically whenever Grandfather dropped something or needed help, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Did you spill again, Father? I just cleaned that." They became perpetually irritable, treating him as nothing more than a burden, suffocating the family atmosphere with palpable tension and unbearable pressure. Grandfather Benito, once a welcomed guest, had become an uninvited tenant in his own son's home. On those nights, after my parents had settled into uneasy sleep, Grandfather and I often sat together in the dim light of the kitchen corner, barely enough to illuminate the deep lines etched on his face. He'd often gaze out the window where the saguaro cacti stood tall in the darkness, and his voice, though frail, carried an immeasurable longing. "Tomas, I miss Santa Fe so much. I miss the smell of wet clay after a rain, the wind singing through the old adobe houses, the feeling of my hands touching our ancestral earth." He'd recount tales of sunrises over the Sangre de Cristo mountains, of the golden fields of Pueblo corn in autumn. "Here," he'd sigh, "I feel like a shadow, lost, like a tree uprooted from its soil." I felt that same emptiness. I'd abandoned my career, lost my initial dream, and now, even in my own family's home, I felt like nothing more than a surplus, a silent burden, staring at the cracks in a family decaying from within by greed. We were two lost souls, my grandfather and I, adrift in our own supposed sanctuary. I couldn't endure my parents' contempt for grandfather any longer, not after all he'd sacrificed. My heart twisted with disgust at how they treated their own aging, frail father. One night, after overhearing my parents' furious argument about how expensive grandfather had become, I made a bold decision. I couldn't stay there another minute. I couldn't bear the hypocrisy and the pervasive greed any longer. I approached grandfather, my voice resolute, though I tried to suppress its tremor. "Grandfather, we're leaving this place. I'll take care of you." Benito looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise, and then a faint flicker of hope ignited in those clouded depths. You mean it, Thomas? You'll take me away?" I nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "Yes, grandfather. We'll go back to Santa Fe. I know you want to be buried in our ancestral lands where your spirit belongs." That was where he belonged, where his soul yearned to return, not where he was treated as a nuisance. The very next morning, I confronted my parents. "I'm taking grandfather with me," I announced, my voice firm. "What are you talking about?" My father, Martin, roared, his face turning crimson. "Who do you think you are to make decisions? You're a failure, still freeloading off us. Where will you get the money to support him?" My mother, Dolores, scoffed. "Ah, so that's it. You want to prove you're the filial one, do you? Or perhaps you're just looking for another way to extort money from your old grandfather, Thomas. You people don't deserve to speak of filial piety." I shot back, my voice trembling with indignation. "You took the money he gave you and still treated him like a beggar. He's not a burden. He's your father." My father lunged forward, nearly slapping me. "Shut your mouth. You're a disgrace. You think you're so noble? Go on then. See how long you last with that senile old man." I said nothing more, just stared directly into their eyes, my gaze filled with profound disappointment and utter contempt. Grandfather and I left that house, taking only a few essentials. I used the meager savings I had left to rent a small apartment in Santa Fe, just enough for the two of us. To make ends meet, I took a job as a convenience store clerk nearby, earning a paltry wage, but I knew it was the right choice. Our life, though modest, meals often consisting of instant noodles and bread, was filled with profound peace and genuine affection. I diligently cared for Grandfather Benito, preparing simple meals, talking with him, and reading to him. These were precious times for us to forge a deep connection, as if making up for years of lost time. "Tomas, my little one," he murmured once, his voice weak but full of tenderness. "You're the only one in this family who truly listens to me. You have a kind heart." During those days, I truly began to listen to Grandfather, not just with my ears, but with my whole soul. Benito was no longer a stranger, but a living treasury of knowledge, a flowing stream of history and ancestral spirit. He told me stories of Mother Earth, of the origins of clay from sacred sites in the Four Corners region, places only the ancient Pueblo people knew. He spoke of ancient rituals to commune with the earth before extracting clay, of the spiritual meaning behind each Pueblo pottery design. They weren't just decorations, they were stories, prayers, a part of our identity, a mark of our ancestors. He spoke of fire spirit and water spirit, the fundamental elements for creating a perfect piece of pottery. Most importantly, Grandfather Benito directly imparted to me the invaluable pottery techniques he had guarded his entire life. "Feel the clay, Thomas," he'd say, his thin, gnarled hand touching the lump of clay in my grasp. It's a part of you, a part of Mother Earth. He showed me how to wedge the clay to remove air bubbles and achieve perfect malleability, a technique he called the dance of the earth. He taught me how to coil build each pot, each bowl, each jar, patiently adding layer upon layer of clay without the need for an industrial potter's wheel. Each coil is a breath, a prayer, he'd murmur. Then came the firing. Fire is the soul of pottery, Thomas. He guided me on how to construct a traditional outdoor pit-firing kiln, how to stack wood and clay just so for even heat distribution, how to read the colors of the smoke and flames to know when the pottery was done. He spoke of the unique fire cloud patterns that danced on the surface of some pieces, a natural beauty created by the flames, an intentional embrace of nature's touch. He also taught me how to mix natural pigments from minerals and desert plants, creating warm, earthy tones that no modern textbook could replicate. I realized the profound void within me when I pursued pottery without truly understanding its roots and soul. I was captivated, diligently documenting every formula, technique, and philosophy into my own worn notebook, each stroke of the pen engraving invaluable lessons, knowing this was the most precious legacy my grandfather was entrusting to me, a flame I had to keep alive. My family, my parents, aunt, and uncle, dismissed my actions as insane, foolish, isolating myself from the family and the share of assets they thought I'd eventually get. They stopped communicating, seeing me as an outcast, a fool who had rejected the easy path and a comfortable life. He's just putting on a show. Does he think he's so righteous? He's ruining his own life. Nobody talked to him anymore. My father yelled over the phone to Uncle Victor, his voice laced with the same contempt and self-satisfaction that I accidentally overheard once at the convenience store. We were completely cut off, as if we had never existed. Even the small gifts I sent them were returned unopened. During this time, Grandfather Benito, in our private conversations, expressed his deep disappointment in his children. They only see money, Tomas. They don't understand the true value of earth, of fire, of tradition, of family. He'd shake his head, his eyes clouded with sadness. They've forgotten their roots. But then his eyes would brighten as he looked at me. You are the only one who truly cherishes the values I uphold and has an honest heart, Thomas. Remember what I've taught you? That is the most precious thing no gold or silver can buy. You are the only one worthy of this legacy. Those words, like a warm fire, rekindled my resolve, making me feel far from alone on this path. Grandfather Benito's health faded frighteningly fast. In our small Santa Fe apartment, every breath he took felt like a desperate struggle. A knot of worry tightened around my heart. I cared for him with everything I had. Spoonfuls of soup, every pill, every gentle wipe of his sweat-dampened forehead. Each night, I'd lie awake listening to his ragged coughs, feeling time slip through my fingers like sand. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, Grandfather Benito weakly gripped my hand. His eyes, though clouded by illness, still held a warm, loving, and trusting light. "Tomas, my son," he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "I'm ready to return to Mother Earth now. You must keep this fire burning. Don't let it die." He said nothing more, just squeezed my hand one last time. A faint, meaningful squeeze, as if entrusting me with a sacred burden. Then his eyes slowly closed, his breathing slowed, and finally stopped. Grandfather Benito passed peacefully in my arms. A wave of grief washed over me like a flood. I held him close, hot tears streaming down my face. But amidst that profound loss, there was also a strange sense of peace. a quiet relief, knowing he was finally free from pain and had returned to the ancestral land he longed for. I knew Grandfather had found eternal serenity. Grandfather Benito's funeral was simple, just as he would have wanted, held at a small church in Santa Fe. I was the only one who handled all the arrangements, from choosing a modest coffin to overseeing the ceremony. My parents, Martin and Dolores, along with Uncle Victor and Aunt Marisol, were there. They stood in their expensive black clothes, but their demeanor was coldly indifferent. There were no genuine tears, no choked sobs. They spoke in hushed tones to each other, their eyes occasionally darting towards me with expressions of confusion or contempt, as if this were merely a social performance to save face. To them, Grandfather Benito was now just a relic, a problem solved. A week after the funeral, as I was trying to get back into the routine of my convenience store job, my phone rang. "Hello, Mr. Thomas Kewa," a formal voice announced. "I'm attorney Mr. Ray Vigil. Mr. Benito Kewa has left a will and requested I contact you." I went to Mr. Ray Vigil's law office, a modern building in downtown Santa Fe. My heart still heavy with the grief of losing Grandfather. Mr. Ray Vigil, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses, invited me to sit and opened a thick file. "This will was drafted over a year ago, Mr. Kewa, right after Mr. Benito moved in with you at your apartment," the attorney began, his voice clear and concise. "It specifically outlines Mr. Benito Kewa's assets." I nodded, expecting the lawyer to reiterate that Grandfather had given my parents the proceeds from the house sale. But what Mr. Ray Vigil said next utterly stunned me. Mr. Benito Kewa also secretly accumulated a substantial fortune throughout his life from astute investments, which he never disclosed to anyone else in his family. The lawyer paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "In total, that amounts to over $2 million. I was dumbfounded, unable to believe my ears. Over $2 million? Grandfather had hidden such a vast treasure. My entire body went rigid. "The entirety of this sum, Mr. Kewa," Mr. Ray Vigil added, "he left solely to you, Thomas Kewa." He continued, "Mr. Benito Kewa clearly explained in his will that he made this decision because you were the only one who genuinely cared for him, truly understood him, and honored the traditional values he held dear his entire life. He trusted that you would be the only one worthy and capable of using this wealth meaningfully, not just for personal gain, but to further the legacy of our family." Immediately, news of the will spread like wildfire through the Kewa family. My parents, aunt, and uncle were utterly stunned, then erupted in furious rage upon learning about this massive fortune they had no knowledge of and no share in. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. "No way!" My father, Martin Kewa, roared over the phone, his voice thick with envy and fury, as if I had stolen something rightfully his. "He hid it from us? What did you do to trick him, Thomas? Did you manipulate him? You're a cheat." My mother, Dolores Kewa, was equally cutting. "That's right. You ungrateful child. You only want the money. You took advantage of that frail old man. He was senile. How could he make a valid will? We'll sue you." Uncle Victor Kewa and Aunt Marisol Kewa also called in unison, interrogating and threatening legal action. "Do you think you're clever, Tomas? He was my father. You're just a grandchild. You have no rights to this," Uncle Victor bellowed. Aunt Marisol coldly declared, "Prepare to face our lawyers. You won't win this." Their anger was like a toxic wave, but I, with a newfound calm, born from my months with Grandfather, faced their accusations. I didn't argue or shout. I simply kept my voice steady and firm. "Grandfather made his decision," I told my parents over the phone, my voice unwavering. He saw who truly cared for him, not for his assets. He trusted me. Attorney Mr. Ray Vigil also proactively contacted them, his voice resolute and professional. Mr. and Mrs. Kewa, I confirm that Mr. Benito Kewa's will is entirely legal, with duly authenticated signatures from witnesses, and was executed when he was of sound mind. Any accusations of fraud or manipulation are baseless. Mr. Benito explicitly left messages detailing his reasons, demonstrating his absolute trust in Thomas Kewa. Any legal action against this would have no merit. The lawyer's words formed a solid wall protecting me, leaving my family seething in frustrated silence and utter powerlessness. With over $2 million in my account, my life truly turned a new page, but not in the way my parents or my aunt and uncle ever imagined. That money wasn't the goal. It was simply a means to fulfill my final promise to grandfather, to keep the fire he had entrusted to me burning bright. I knew the true soul of his legacy wasn't in bank figures, but in the Pueblo pottery knowledge Grandfather Benito had directly imparted to me, and in every stroke of my worn notebook. I decided not to leave Santa Fe. This was where my grandfather belonged, and now it was also where I found the true meaning of my life. I used a portion of the inheritance to purchase a spacious, tranquil piece of land not far from grandfather's old house. On that land, I began building a center, not just a pottery workshop, but a vibrant living space to honor and cultivate his art. I named it the Benito Kewa Pottery Institute. My institute isn't a mass production factory. It's a place where tradition and creativity intertwine. I built a main workshop area with simple work tables, a spacious exhibition hall, and most importantly, an outdoor pit firing kiln constructed exactly according to the traditional methods grandfather had taught me. I even dedicated a section to a small library, filled with books on Pueblo history, pottery art, and ancient writings I managed to acquire. I began crafting pottery with my own hands. With each lump of clay, I remembered grandfather's words. Feel the clay as a living being. I meticulously selected the finest local clays, performing the wedge technique to knead the earth, removing air bubbles, and achieving perfect malleability. I used the coiling method to build each pot, each bowl, each jar, not with an electric wheel, but solely with my hands and immense patience. I applied the natural pigment formulas from minerals and desert plants that grandfather had passed down, creating warm, unique, earthy tones like the vermilion red from iron-rich clay or the mysterious deep black derived from smoke firing. During firing, I used the outdoor pit firing method, stacking clay and wood exactly as grandfather instructed, allowing the flames to slowly bake each piece. I learned to read the fire, knowing when the temperature reached its perfect point to create natural smoke patterns on the pottery surface, or when to adjust for that distinctive fire cloud effect. My creations didn't just carry the beauty of ancient Pueblo art with its geometric patterns and sacred animal imagery like birds, turtles, and snakes. They also breathed a contemporary spirit in their clean lines and minimalist aesthetic. My work quickly gained recognition. Collectors and art galleries in Santa Fe and even New York began reaching out. They were captivated by the unique blend of exquisite traditional techniques and contemporary breath in each of my pieces. I wasn't just selling pottery, I was selling a story, a legacy. But my goal extended far beyond business. I used a significant portion of the funds to sponsor Pueblo cultural preservation projects. I invited young potters from various tribes to the Benito Kewa Pottery Institute to learn and exchange experiences. I organized free workshops for the community, especially children, so they could touch the clay, listen to the stories of their ancestors, and keep this artistic flame alive. I also hosted annual exhibitions, inviting researchers and historians to speak about the profound importance of Pueblo pottery in indigenous culture. I was no longer Thomas Kewa, the failure at 30. I had become a cultural conservator, a respected potter, a bridge between the past and future of the Pueblo people. My name appeared in art publications, and I received invitations to speak at heritage preservation forums. This recognition didn't stem from the inherited fortune. It came from my dedication, the knowledge grandfather had imparted, and my genuine love for the art. My family, my parents, aunt, and uncle, still kept their distance. They no longer called with threats or insults, but their envy and regret were palpable whenever I happened to encounter them. I held no resentment. The peace within my soul had grown far larger than those negative emotions. When they tried to make contact, I responded briefly, politely, but I no longer allowed them to intrude upon my life or my work. I had learned that some relationships, even blood ties, need to be kept at a certain remove to protect one's own inner peace. Standing in the Benito Kewa Pottery Institute, amidst the pottery waiting to be fired, amidst the joyful laughter of children enthusiastically shaping clay, I felt a profound sense of peace and purpose I had long sought. I looked up at the vast blue sky of Santa Fe, where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains still stood majestically like ancient guardians. Grandfather Benito was always with me, not just in memory, but in every lump of clay I kneaded, in every flame I ignited, in every design I painted, and in the sparkling eyes of the young students eager to learn. His legacy wasn't money. It was the soul of Pueblo art, the philosophy of life, and the love that illuminated my path, helping me find myself and my true purpose. The story concludes with me, Tomas Kewa, continuing my journey, no longer a failure, but a guardian of the flame, an inheritor of a grand legacy, living a meaningful and fulfilling life in my ancestral land, where I had truly found my home. Hey viewers, welcome to the channel. We're just getting started, and your support means a lot. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Thanks for being here.